You are listening to InCites, produced by the University of New South Wales Law Society, a podcast dedicated to bring you an insight into law school, the legal profession, and legal issues. The production team would also like to show our respects and acknowledge the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land, of elders past and present on which this podcast is made. Unfortunately, our original guest was unavailable this week. Luckily, we have UNSW alumni Sam Lee here to talk about the hardships and joys, the ups and downs of studying and working in the law. Graduating in 2019, he is still deeply involved within the university community. During his studies, he was a part of Model UN, FMAA, Law Revue and Law Society. More recently, he has also begun to take an interest in consultancy and has been part of 180 Degrees Consulting, the global leadership team. When not working, he plays for his band, the Flamingos, which regularly performs at UNSW events. Thanks so much, Sam, for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, firstly, congratulations on your first live gig with the Flamingos. How was it?
It was a pretty amazing experience. Really glad that we got that. To be honest, we didn't think we'd sell 10 tickets, let alone sell out 2 shows. We're extremely happy at how it went. Can't really describe what it's like being on stage and performing songs that we wrote ourselves and recorded at the height of COVID. So yeah, it was a pretty surreal experience.
So I'm friends with a few members of the band, for example, Josh, Madison, Chelsea by proxy. How did you guys actually got the idea to start a band in the first place?
Well, this is going back a long way. So Josh Madison and I played together in the Law Society band. I think it was 2017, and then we played together again in 2018. I then did Law Revue in my last year of university, and that's where I met Matt, Shamus, and Jara, who were the other members of the band. And then I think out of that, we thought, this is really fun. We really don't want to let this feeling go when we leave. Let's try and start something. And I remember very vividly, our first gig was someone's 21st birthday party. Musically, it was absolutely terrible, but it was an incredibly fun experience. And just contrasting that to the gig the other night, the level and quality is so different. It makes me reflect on how far we've come. But I guess in essence, we just had a good time together doing different things and decided, let's start this, let's give this a go. If it doesn't work out, that's fine. But 3 years later, here we are.
The thing is, law students are kind of famous for having quite a large workload most of the time. How did you manage to kind of juggle all those commitments?
When I think back myself, an easy answer doesn't really come to mind. I think probably the best way of answering that question is that it takes a lot of time. So I probably have to go back all the way to maybe year 7 or 8 in high school, when I was terrified of doing any extracurriculars because I thought this is going to harm my marks. If I even set foot in a room that isn't a classroom, my scores are going to go down. Yeah. I think progressively over time, I got used to doing more and more things and handling that load. But I think the key thing is it's really just a matter of priorities. So what I did was I had a very clear sense in my mind what the important things were and then what sort of came after that. And those priorities evolved over time as well. So I think when I first started my law school, it was mostly about getting the marks to get into law and then so forth. But then I think towards the end, I sort of valued some of the more extracurricular stuff a bit more and spent more time there. And even now, I think working full time, that's obviously a big load, but there's an old saying that it doesn't really feel like work if you're having fun. And I think that really applies to a lot of the things I'm doing. It's stuff that I enjoy. With the band, for example, it's only really an hour per week where we have a meeting or we catch up and that's it. And when we have a gig, it's a little bit more, but you sort of move things around. So I think it happens over a period of time.
And with that transition from high school, I guess what started that switch?
I think I came to appreciate that there's a lot more to be learned than you can just learn from books. And when I think back to some of my biggest learning experiences, they have nothing to do with what happens in the classroom and everything to do with life experiences. And in fact, usually, failures or bad experiences. I'm not embarrassed to tell a very brief story, which is when I was in kindergarten, we got told to stand up in front of the class, introduce ourselves, and say our favorite food or something. And I was absolutely terrified. I remember the whole class had to turn around and face the wall. It was the most absurd thing ever. And then I think in year 7, my dad encouraged me to do debating. And I still remember saying, cool, I'll be the team advisor because that person never has to speak.
Yeah, the fourth speaker, right?
Exactly. But funny enough, I ended up as first speaker, which means I either speak first or second every single time. And it didn't actually turn out to be as bad as I thought. I think I gained the confidence over time, got better at it. And public speaking is now something that I really, really enjoy, and communicating is something I enjoy. Same thing with being on stage, you know, when you're playing music in front of people in school band, you sort of get used to what that feeling is like. So I think experiences like that in year 7 when I did debating made me realize, hey, there's so much more to be learned. There's all this other exciting stuff I can get involved with, you know, musically, sports, debating. I can really enrich myself in that way. And I think since then I've really always gravitated towards what's the next experience I can have that can help me learn, can help me develop. What's the next adventure, so to speak. So I think it really started with those experiences. And if I hadn't, I guess, dipped my toe in the water or been encouraged at that early point, I don't know if I'd be in the same place because I would never have had, you know, those kind of experiences.
The funny thing about bringing up school stories and stuff like that is you realize how formative those years are in terms of creating the interests, the passions that you have. I have a very similar story, but it kind of works the other way where I used to actually be really, really interested in science. My friends these days know how much I actually hate mathematics, science, and all that stuff, right? One Christmas, I got like a set of encyclopedia books, right? And I decided one day to go through it. I flicked to the geology section and I saw all these beautiful and awesome rocks. And so I spent 2 days, I remember this, I spent 2 whole days going into my back garden, looking for different stones and categorizing them based off what I saw. I hand wrote a bunch of labels and sticky taped them onto the rocks and stuff. And then I remember the next day when I took it to show and tell, the teacher, instead of being very calm and fostering that kind of inquisitiveness, she just immediately said, "Harry, aren't those just all pebbles?" And I just remember immediately afterwards, I decided to just dump them all in the bin.
Because I have a sort of similar story to your rock story, which is I was fascinated by dinosaurs as a kid. At the school that I first started off at, I was known as the dinosaur kid because I could name, I think, obscure species to people. And I did spend my lunchtimes digging up rocks as well, ironically, to look for dinosaur bones. So you would have thought back then, you know, I would have become like a paleontologist or some sort of like science person. But, you know, obviously that changed. But yeah, in year 9, I decided law is what I wanted to do. And that came from, I guess, stepping out of my comfort zone and trying different things. And I think my interests have sort of shifted a little bit since that time as well, naturally, as you get older. And I can now observe that a lot of those insights, you know, you mentioned consulting, for example, came from trying new things. You know, the 180 Degrees Global Leadership Team is something I jumped into last year midway through the grad program as a full-time lawyer. You know, I'd never done any prior consulting stuff, never any 180 stuff, but I thought to myself, what do I really enjoy? Where do I want to make an impact? What do I want to learn? This is a great opportunity to do that. Why not do that? There's no reason why once you start working full-time, you need to constrain yourself to what you're doing. Really, there's no distinction, I think, between what I'm doing now and what I was doing in year 7, which is you have some core interests, but always keep open-minded. Because if I just said to myself, I know what I'm into, that's it, in kindergarten, there's no chance of me performing music or public speaking or even doing law because I would have been too scared to come out of my shell. So I think that's probably the process that helped me get there.
And me, for example, I actually did debating in high school as well. And a lot of my friends who ended up studying law from my high school were in that exact same debating team. I feel like it's often the case where people who, for example, do those co-curriculars such as mock trial, public speaking, kind of feel that it's just a natural progression to kind of go into the law. Do you feel like that it's a problem for all these kids to kind of just pigeonhole themselves into what is actually a professional degree so early on?
This is getting a little bit philosophical, but I remember in high school, there were always 2 questions I really wanted to answer. One is, who am I as a person, and secondly, what do I want to commit myself to work-wise? Like, what's going to be my passion? What's going to be the main thing I do? I think I was very keen to try and latch onto something that I was good at and just do that thing. And I think even throughout law school, there was a bit of a path set out in front of me where it's like, these are the things you need to do this path. So, you do mooting, you do law soc, or you do all these other stuff, and then you become a lawyer, right? But the reality is, I don't think, at least from my experience, I've ever really figured out with certainty that this is exactly the thing I want to do. The way that I probably look at it is, I know what the next step is down the tunnel, the next thing I'm interested in, but I'm very open to what might happen down the line. So it's entirely possible that I move out of law into another field, that I stay in law, that I do something radically different. I mean, the band is a great example of that, right? I think it's very easy to play it safe and to construct for yourself what you think the steps you need to take are to achieve a certain vision of your future. So I looked at myself and I thought, if I want to be a lawyer, these are the things I need to do to get there. I don't think it's a bad idea to have goals, but I think it's always important to be open-minded, which is why increasingly, I guess, in uni and towards the end of my degree, I tried to do experiences that were atypical for someone down my path, because in the same way that in year 7, stepping out of my comfort zone got me into debating, got me interested in law, there could be things that I'm interested in or things that I'm good at that I'm just not aware of because I haven't tried them. I'm going to use law review as a great example, because I had always seen so many people do it, so many of my friends do it, and I thought to myself, I'm not a law review person, this is not my kind of thing. But once I sort of got my grad offer at the beginning of my last year of uni, and I sort of felt I could sort of experiment a bit more with my last year of uni, I jumped into review, and it was so good I came back again the next year, even though I was working full time, because it was such a great experience, and a completely different experience to anything that I'd done before. So moving forward now with the benefit of that experience, the 180 thing is a great example, and I'm sure I'm going to do things that are quite unexpected but interesting in the future. And I think having that sort of flexibility is a good thing, but it took me time to get comfortable with that.
The mentality I have had going to uni is that there are specific things that I have to complete in order to call myself a good uni student. For example, last year I did law review because I knew for a fact that I can't happily call myself as having had that university experience unless I complete it. Or I needed to be a part of like a subcommittee or join as the leadership team, for example, for Law Society. What were kind of the, I guess, big ticket items for you?
I actually, not many people know, I actually didn't get the ATAR to get into law directly. So I was a transfer student. And so I think when I first started, I was very keen to prove to myself that I was good enough to be in law school and could make it sort of as a lawyer. And so that probably gave that perspective a bit more of a hold over me. So when I looked at it, I thought law soc is probably a good one. I thought about mooting definitely being very visible. The way I used to look at it is, what are 3 or 4 very different things that I can do each year? Maybe not 3 or 4, maybe 2 or 3 that are completely different, that will teach me different things, but at the same time are going to help me move down that path. So I remember in first year, I tried out all the different competitions. So if I think about it now, incredibly, I think I did first. I think I dipped my toe into every skills competition, every mooting competition in first year, just to try it. And it was only, I think, until later on that I got involved in other stuff like law peer tutoring, mentoring, review, some of these other things that may not have sort of been on my radar when I had that perspective. But I think those are probably the key things when I was at that stage.
You mentioned that you have a completely different mindset. What's your view of success now?
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is I think everyone's view of success is subjective. Yeah. I think it's self-defined, and it took me a long time to get to that position as well. I think success is self-defined, and by the same token, evaluating whether or not you're succeeding is also an internal thing. I think for me at least personally, success is maybe, I would say 2 things. One is feeling like I'm making the most of the ability that I have in any given field. And 2 is leaving a positive mark on the world. And I think those are probably two things that have been consistent with me probably since I was quite young, as a primary school student. But I think the way that I judge those things is a little bit different as well. So when I look at making the most of my ability, that comes from how you define yourself. So if you define yourself as a law student, then you're going to gravitate towards certain ways of, I guess, expressing your ability and your passions. I think I'm much more open-minded now about what those things are. One way I like to look at it is, what are all the things that I'm really interested in and really passionate about? And I'm going to commit to myself that at least once I'm going to give each of those a go. So music is something I did a lot in school. I expected to lose touch with that entirely in uni, but with the band, we gave it a shot, and it's now become something a little bit more than that, which is great. Sports, for example, I joined a club team for the first time last year, and I'm actually going to be coaching a team this year. It's something I've never done before, but something I'm passionate about, so giving that a go. I've mentioned this to a few friends who find this hilarious, but I'm a really big sort of video games person, so I want to give voice acting a shot maybe. I did a lot of creative writing competitions when I was a kid, so I want to sort of, as a very unlikely aspirational goal, I want to publish like a fiction novel one day or something. And these are all, if you had said this to me when I was in high school or uni, I would have thought that's really amusing. But now I sort of think to myself, why not just give that a shot? Why not just try it and see it? So to answer that question about what success is to me, I think back then I probably would have looked at success as probably career success. Now it's more holistically, because for me, I've never really separated career and personal passions. I've never really thought, I'm going to work, this is terrible, now I'm going to have fun. I want to be able to express and engage with my passions in everything I do. And so as part of that, I want to be working in a job that's going to help me explore that as well. So I think it has to be very internally defined, and I think it also has to be quite open-minded, I think, as well.
I think a big issue that a lot of, especially younger law students, face is that they see themselves as being able to have that freedom once they get that grad offer. Do you reckon that students should instead find their passions much earlier through their degree?
I think that's a very individual choice to make. When I look back now, always really admired people who did things that they were passionate about regardless of the career implications. And I think the answer to that question is that everyone has to find their own way. There is definitely merit in doing things that are safer earlier on. Although if I recall something that the speaker at my, of course it's not the inauguration, it's called the undergraduate welcome, sorry, I was thinking about inauguration. Sean Lau, the speaker, said, if you're keeping your options open, all you're really doing is deferring a decision you have to make until later. So I think that's quite a good point, actually. So for me, to sort of answer that question, the way I look at it is that I think most people benchmark their goals, their expectations, what they should do based on what most people around them do, because there's a bit of a safety in walking that path. So for example, there's safety in, all right, I've started law school, I'm going to get involved in mooting, I'm going to do a clerkship, etc. That's the path to go down. And to an extent, there's some merit to that. There's a reason why lots of people go down that path. But I think the question you have to answer at the end of the day, the question, to bring back that quote that you're always ultimately deferring is, what am I really interested in? And in some cases, that's going to overlap with what most other people are doing, but in other cases, it won't. And so for me, what I like to do is try and keep track of what I'm doing to make sure that I'm actually chasing what I want to do rather than what other people are doing. Because if you chase what other people's goals are, all you're going to end up with at best is someone else's dream rather than your own. And I think that, so I think a good way of getting around that is to think about what at heart makes you passionate, what at heart you really enjoy. And I particularly like moments where I realize that I'm a little bit unconventional or going against the grain, which has happened to me a couple of times recently, because that sort of demonstrates to me I'm walking my own path rather than just following the safe path. And, as we sort of discussed before, it took me a while to get to the point where I was comfortable doing that. I think if I had my chance to do it again, I'd probably do things similarly, but I'd probably take more risks than I did and get involved in other things that I didn't before. So that's, I guess, my 2 cents of advice, but I think it's very individual. It depends on different people.
I mean, hopefully after this podcast gets released, you'll see a bunch of more bands popping up out of nowhere from within law school. Just one final question before we wrap up. Where do you see yourself, or where do you hope to see yourself in 10 years?
I always hate these questions because it's very difficult to answer. I used to, I remember in my first ILJ class, a friend of mine, Jack, said that I whipped out my my life plan in front of him, and he's made fun of me for that ever since. And quite genuinely, I did have a plan. I set out, first year I'm going to do this, second year I'm going to do this, third year. And to be honest, it never panned out exactly as I planned. It's always very different. So ever since I started full-time work, I've only really planned probably a year, 18 months max ahead. And that's because, all the way through from primary school to uni, my experience has been your life is somewhat well regimented by what you're doing. But once you start work, there's an ocean of possibilities, which can make it difficult to know whether you're succeeding, can make it difficult to know how you're progressing, because it's just very different. And the one thing I never wanted is for the years to meld together and to think, where did those 5 years go? So for me, 5-10 years time, I can't probably visualize what that will look like, but I hope to be doing very different things to what I'm doing now, possibly being in a different country, possibly being in a different field, possibly being able to talk about different experiences than the ones that I've talked about today, and possibly having a whole list of failures, mistakes, as well as some successes that haven't happened yet, because I think that's the best way for me to achieve those things that I want to do, which is make the most of my potential and try and give back in a positive way. So hopefully that's not too long-winded or wishy-washy an answer.
Definitely not. As someone with a 30-year plan for myself up ahead, that's really good advice. Thanks again, Sam, for coming.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the second episodes of InCites with UNSW Law Society. I'm your host, Harry, and if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss out on a single episode.